Hey guys, we're almost to the end of Unit 5, and it's time to talk about one more way that we use land, and that is mining. So let's go ahead and jump into our PowerPoint and talk about some of the ways that we mine, as well as some of the reasons that we mine. All right. So obviously, we're always going to be talking about how we mine as well as the environmental impacts of mining. So first, let's talk about why we mine and what it is that we mine. And so when we're mining, what we extract from the ground is generally called ore. And ore is a concentrated accumulation of minerals, but it is usually not the pure material that we are seeking. It has to be further purified. Very often what we are mining for is metals. Hopefully we remember from our chemistry that metals are chemical elements that can conduct electricity. They can also conduct heat energy, and they perform an awful lot of functions for us. Some of the most commonly mined metals are iron, copper, nickel, aluminum, and of course, gold. And one term that we'll run across a lot as we're talking about mining is a reserve. And when we talk about reserves, we're talking about the known quantity of a resource that can be recovered feasibly, economically. Excuse me. So when we talk about the composition of the Earth's crust, the single most abundant element in the Earth's crust by mass is oxygen, followed by silicon. And we think about sand, that's usually silicon dioxide. So that's those two elements very close together. Then most of the other things that we mine for, aluminum, iron, are there, but in much smaller quantities. And you notice that the other things that we mentioned that we mine for aren't even mentioned on this list. So they're over there in that others component of 1% of the Earth's crust. So in order to extract these things, how can we do it? So we'll talk about two major classes of mining techniques, and that would be surface mining and subsurface mining. So surface mining is exactly what it sounds like. It's mining that happens at the surface of the earth. The surface is removed and we take something that is close to the surface. Subsurface mining is probably what most of us think of when we think of mining. We think of coal miners deep in caves, caverns, and chambers underground. That is subsurface mining. All mining produces waste, and that waste we call tailings or slag. So let's talk about types of surface mining. The first one that we're going to talk about is strip mining. And when we talk about strip mining, we're talking about the removal of strips of soil or rock in order to expose the ore that is near the surface. So all surface mining is, generally speaking, within 100 feet of the surface. In order to strip mine, we're going to remove that material. We're going to extract the resource, sometimes on site, and sometimes it has to be trucked away to an extraction point. And then we're going to return those spoils and tailings, those unwanted waste materials, back to the area from which they were removed. The most common surface mining that you'll see is for coal, strip mining that you'll see is for coal. Also, sand and certain types of rock are mined this way as well. So when you hear about a quarry, that's a rock mine. Okay, so that's strip mining. Another very common type of surface mining. Another very common type of surface mining, here we go, there we go, is what we call open pit mining. And open pit mining uses a large visible pit, also usually stepped down, so it looks very similar to strip mining. Again, the resource is very close to the surface, and this is very often the way that copper is mined. And it's a very similar process where the overburden, the area above the ore is removed and purified, and then those tailings and slag are returned back to the pit. And the most destructive form of surface mining is called mountaintop removal. So mountaintop removal is exactly what it sounds like. They use explosives to basically blow the top off of the hill or mountain in which the ore is found. The reason that this is so much more destructive than strip mining or pit mining is that those explosives tend to throw the tailings everywhere. So rather than them being contained and trucked off to an off-site location and then being able to be returned, they can't really be returned back to the mountaintop. So let's talk about that process of things being removed and then returned. So this is kind of stages rather than actually looking like this is what's happening all at the same time. So first, in order to surface mine, vegetation has to be removed, and it's usually mulched and then mixed with topsoil in order to be used later on. The topsoil is also removed with it. And so those two things are stored so that when the mining is complete, the mulch and the topsoil can be placed back over the top. Then overburden tends to be blasted away, excavated and removed by dump trucks. And then usually holes are drilled and we start removing large quantities of overburden. And that overburden is trucked off to the side and kind of arranged in giant piles so that then as they remove the ore and once the mine has been depleted of all of the ore, the overburden is then moved back into the mine. The topsoil and mulch are used to cover up where the mine used to be, and it is restored as close as possible to the original contours of the land. However, this is often what it looks like. So this is actually an example of mountaintop removal. And you can see this is the before picture of this area. And this is the after picture of the area, despite the fact that there are regulations in place requiring that topsoil is removed, replaced, and then that vegetation is returned. Fourth kind of surface mining is what we think of when we think of the gold rush. It's what's called placer mining. So what that is simply looking in river sediment to see if there are ores, minerals, or metals that have been removed from underground by the movement of water. Okay, so moving on to subsurface mining. Now we're talking about a resource that's more than 100 meters below the surface. It is much more expensive. It is also, generally speaking, much more dangerous for the people involved. Diamonds, gold, and coal are very commonly mined this way through subsurface mining. There are lots of different forms of subsurface mining. All of them involve tunnels, whether those tunnels are horizontal, vertical, or even at an angle. So this is what we call a slope mine. This is a vertical shaft mine. And you can see that in both cases, there's a shaft going down, whether it's inclined or vertical. And then there are different levels of tunnels underneath that are then used to access the ore. And the type of mine really depends on the contours of the land as well as where the location of the ore is. So what are the environmental impacts of mining? Well, as far as the air, all surface mining particularly throws a lot of dust particles into the air. It can free methane that has been buried underground. And then there tend to be lots of carbon dioxide emissions because this is very large, very heavy equipment. So when we look at these pictures of the dump trucks, generally speaking, the diameter of these tires is about 25 feet. Just to give you a picture of scale, that's actually a full-size truck behind that truck, and you can see the size of its tire as compared to the size of the truck tire. So very, very large equipment, which uses a lot of fossil fuels and puts a lot of carbon dioxide into the air. There's also a lot of water contamination that occurs with mining. Before or after mining is concluded, as water percolates through the tailings, it's going to pick up all of the contaminants in those tailings. Remember, the tailings are the waste from the mine. These tend to be very heavily acidified, which means that they're also going to pick up heavy metals from the soil, as well as leach nutrients from the soil. So this water, when it runs over soil, has the ability to deplete the nutrients from the soil, acidify the soil, making it less able to grow plants, and it acidifies the streams that it then enters, as well as bringing along with it any other contaminants for the streams, lakes, and rivers that it eventually enters. Obviously, when soil is removed and then is placed back, the compaction of that soil is going to be different. It may be more prone to erosion, or it may be more compacted and more difficult to grow in. So loss of vegetation is also going to increase erosion. And of course, habitats are destroyed. They are, if not destroyed, very often degraded. They are fragmented, even in areas where the mine itself doesn't have an impact, but the roads to the mines have an impact by fragmenting habitat. And so this loss of habitat or fragmentation of habitat is going to have a major impact on biodiversity. So we have four major environmental impacts: air, water, soil, and biodiversity. There is also significant human impact, especially for subsurface mining. There are a lot of respiratory diseases that are associated with subsurface mining because of miners breathing in contaminated air. So there's a huge human impact as well. The first mining legislation is the mining law, or at least the first federal mining legislation is the mining law of 1872, which allows individuals and companies to recover ores and fuels from federal lands. This law is still in effect, and it is effectively unchanged. Companies can still recover ores and fuels from federal lands. There are very few provisions for environmental protection. However, in 1977, a legislation was passed called the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. In environmental circles, this is known as SMCRA. And what this says is that land must be minimally disturbed during coal mining, and then it must be reclaimed. And the definition of reclaimed is that it has to be restored as closely as possible to the original contours. There's a lot of other legislation related to mining. The Clean Air Act obviously applies to air pollution. The Clean Water Act applies to the water pollution. And then the Superfund Act is the act that is designed to reclaim areas that have had substantial pollution due to industry. So that's mining in a nutshell, and we'll talk more about it in class. But as always, if you have questions, let me know.